The Fukushima nuclear disaster was the result of a tragic natural catastrophe, outdated infrastructure, and critical oversights by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, also known as TEPCO. The root of the crisis started with a report on March 7th of 2011, just 4 days before the disaster, where TEPCO identified the plant's vulnerability to tsunamis. The report cited a tsunami in 1897 with 10.2 meter waves and pointed that the plant's seawall, which was 5.7 meters, would be inadequate. Instead of acting immediately, officials decided to review the problem at a later date, postponing crucial upgrades. On March 11th of 2011, a 9.1 magnitude earthquake struck, triggering an automatic shutdown of reactors 1, 2, and 3. Despite the shutdown, nuclear fuel remained dangerously hot, and emergency generators were activated to keep the reactors cool. Initially, the systems functioned as designed, but at 3:46 p.m., a 14-meter tsunami overtopped the seawall, flooding the plant and disabling power sources, including the generators and their fuel tanks, which had been installed in vulnerable underground locations. With cooling systems offline, temperatures inside the reactors soared, and over the next several hours and days, the cores of reactors 1, 2, and 3 began to melt down. Efforts to restore power, vent steam, and inject seawater were made under increasingly desperate conditions. Despite the necessity, TEPCO's headquarters at one point ordered a halt to seawater injection due to contamination fears. The on-site plant chief, Masato Yoshida, defied that order, prioritizing reactor safety over protocol. Despite efforts, hydrogen gas explosions occurred, which blew apart the reactor buildings and injured several workers. Ultimately, these events led to a mass evacuations, long-term radioactive contamination, and the designation of a 20-kilometer exclusion zone. It became clear that TEPCO had not adequately maintained its aging reactors, many of which were over 40 years old, and had failed to test or modernize critical safety systems. The disaster was a product of neglected warnings, outdated technology, poor design choices, and delayed decision-making. The Fukushima disaster was somewhat caused by the corporate culture within TEPCO that discouraged transparency and prioritized reputation and saving money over their stated value of safety. Internally, executives were aware of the plant's vulnerability to tsunamis, but they chose not to act immediately. The value driving this decision appeared to be protecting corporate image and avoiding costly upgrades rather than prioritizing public safety. There was also no public disclosure of this risk, which denied citizens their critical right to safety information. TEPCO employees were also expected to follow orders without question. Obedience to authority was prioritized. For example, when the headquarters ordered to halt the seawater injection, workers initially complied. Thankfully, Plant Chief Yoshida disobeyed TEPCO's order and potentially prevented an even worse outcome by allowing the reactors to cool, even at the risk of contaminating the environment and losing his job. This moment highlights where individual ethical judgment overrode the corporate pressure, which is something the organization had not supported. TEPCO's leadership also exhibited confirmation bias, selectively believing that the disaster was unlikely despite historical events like the 1897 tsunami. This bias likely made them dismiss the urgency of acting on the tsunami threat. Within both TEPCO and Japan's nuclear regulatory agencies, there was also groupthink, a shared belief that the plant was secure, which discouraged dissenting voices or critical safety discussions. Even maintenance of emergency systems was neglected for decades, in part because no one wanted to challenge the assumption that the plant would function safely without them. Moreover, the public was repeatedly told radiation levels were not dangerous even after explosions had occurred, to prevent panic. This shows a lack of honesty and transparency, as TEPCO and government officials appeared to be more focused on controlling public perception than on providing potentially life-saving information. One of the most important lessons engineers can learn from the Fukushima disaster is the need to actively challenge unhealthy organizational dynamics, especially when those dynamics suppress dissent, minimize risk perception, or discourage transparency. In this case, TEPCO had a long-standing culture of obedience to authority and avoiding conflict, which made it difficult for engineers and staff to question decisions from superiors or raise concerns about known safety vulnerabilities. If I could go back in time to influence the case, I would make sure engineers were trained in ethical decision making. This could have encouraged engineers to perform safety checks and speak out more readily when the company seemed out of line. This could have prevented this horrible disaster.